a lightning-fast special operation by Ukrainian special forces in Crimea. Special forces operatives from the Gurprimari unit destroyed a Russian MiG-29 fighter jet. This happened at the Kacha military airfield. That same night, our intelligence officers struck the Irtysh radar complex near Simferopol. Intelligence emphasized that they are systematically destroying enemy air defense and aviation on the peninsula. Let me remind you, in September, this same unit burned 2 rare amphibious aircraft. Shaheds are now capable of launching missiles. Russia has used a drone with an R-60 air-to-air-guided missile for the first time. Ukrainian air defense forces managed to bring down such a device. The new version of the Shahed is faster and most likely experimental. However, what was the enemy targeting? What danger do drones with missiles on board pose, and how can we protect ourselves from them? Mikhailo Menelyuk found out all of this. The Russians are actively ramping up the production of attack drones. According to the Ministry of Digital Transformation, in just September and October, the occupiers used nearly 11,000 UAVs against Ukraine, including Shaheds. And it is these drones that the enemy is constantly improving. They are being equipped with jet engines, remote control, and now these drones will also be able to launch missiles.
They're dangerous, but it's not a major threat because, firstly, these missiles are old. Secondly, they have very limited capabilities to be launched from a Shahed.
Russia has used a drone with an air-launched guided missile for the first time.
An R-60 air-to-air missile.
These frames show the moment such a device was shot down. According to aviation experts, most likely the enemy has started hunting Ukrainian helicopters and planes.
The range of this missile, if we're talking about for heat-seeking locked-on targets, the rear hemisphere of the aircraft is about 4 to 5 kilometers. If it's the front hemisphere of the aircraft or helicopter, then it's about 1.5 to 2 kilometers. In reality, this is an old Soviet missile. It was only partially effective, and it has certain issues with its homing head.
Experts note that this version of the Shahed is still experimental for now. Moreover, the launcher on the drone is installed incorrectly, so the missile is unlikely to be able to launch and pursue its target.
What we saw is that the missile is located on top of the structure itself. What does this tell us? If we're talking about an aviation pylon, the APU-60, it's a pylon that allows for a free fall release of the munition. It's not a catapult, it simply releases the missile. It drops a few centimeters, the engine ignites, and then it continues to pursue its target. In this case, in this configuration, the missile is locked onto the Shahed. Therefore, at this point, it's impossible to talk about using the missile directly as a means of attack.
Even if the Russians managed to activate the R-60's engine, the exhaust would burn through the Shahed's body, aviation experts note. Moreover, a drone equipped with such weaponry won't be able to fly in the so-called swarm of strike drones. As a result, it will be easy to detect using radar. In turn, Ukrainian aviation will have to fire off more flares to lure the missile into them.
The old Soviet missile will react to all the flares. Apparently, it will be necessary to install additional batteries to minimize this risk. Previously, on radars, the smaller the target, the smaller the blip it produced. It will look different on radars because it acts as a corner reflector.
The R-60 missile carries only 3 kilograms of explosives, so it poses a threat only to airplanes and helicopters. Russia stole the scheme of using drones with missiles from Ukraine, in particular when unmanned seaboats successfully struck enemy warships.
But there we realized that they don't work against aircraft, those old Soviet missiles. And here it's just a dumb warhead. Wherever there's a bigger heat source, that's where it will go. Moreover, for every Shahed equipped with a missile, that's one less that can hit our infrastructure targets.
It's possible that cameras were installed on the downed drone with the missile, and this device was being directly operated by an operator from Russian territory. Perhaps the enemy was hoping that Ukrainian fighter jets or helicopters would crash into this drone themselves. Be that as it may, for Army aviation, which is currently attacking enemy UAVs, this still remains a threat that must be dealt with, including with the help of interceptor drones, which are proving their effectiveness.
Right now, we are working towards achieving the target that the president has already announced, which is to have 1,000 interceptors per day. We are, let's say, moving towards this goal quite confidently.
Interceptor drones are currently one of the most effective ways to destroy all types of Russian UAVs.
The enemy is trying in every possible way to weaken Ukrainian air defense. They are testing different configurations, experimenting chaotically and brutally. They are constantly trying out options and looking for ways to turn their drones into effective weapons. Recently, the Russians used a Shahed drone with online control to attack a mobile fire group. Mikhailo Menelyuk, Valentin Bilic, details on the Intermarathon TV channel. United News.
Despite sanctions and significant expenditures, Russia is increasing its military budget to a record $166 billion. And this is happening against the backdrop of a huge state treasury deficit and rising prices. Salaries are falling, roads are crumbling, and hospitals and schools are deteriorating. Military spending is draining Russia's economy, but when will the point of no return come? And how much longer can Russia keep fighting? Our international correspondent Svitlana Chernetska has gathered analysts' opinions on this matter.
And it's probably about 70 kilometers like this. All the shoulders are packed, all the parking lots, gas stations. Since
year after year, the same scene plays out on the Baikal Highway. As soon as the temperature drops below zero, total chaos takes over the road. Because of ice and snowfall, cars have been stuck for 3 days. Winter has come again. Unexpectedly, the highway was not prepared for the weather conditions. And in general, there isn't enough money for the roads, just like for many other basic needs. This year's Russian budget has a record deficit. And for next year, they've also planned cuts to government and social programs.
For ordinary people, this means that what they have, they will no longer have. And as for schools, hospitals, clinics, and vital transportation roads, along with the entire housing and essential utilities sector, are all destined to completely collapse. Every single one of these critical systems is heading towards utter failure and disrepair. The constant pipeline ruptures, severe water main breaks, and widespread sewage bursts, coupled with the numerous collapsed houses and dilapidated buildings that are visibly falling apart, will inevitably and progressively worsen over time, leading to an even more dire situation. Life will very quickly return to a state of hardship. Like in the 1990s, when many enterprises were closed or went bankrupt during the transition period. In the
Russian budget for 2026, spending on education, healthcare, and the regions has been reduced. Taxes are rising in the country and inflation is accelerating. The economy has essentially split into two parts. The military sector survives on budget injections, while the civilian sector is in decline. And it's getting worse.
Now, all available resources are being taken from the civilian sector to support the military sector. And this means that if you work in the civilian economy, your wages are either not being paid at all or are being reduced. There is a whole range of significant everyday challenges faced by the average Russian, unless they are part of the clique that supports Putin's circle of friends.
However, in Putin's Russia, the well-being of citizens is deliberately sacrificed. The budget for 2026 was passed in a record short time, without any changes.
This shows that, of course, there is enormous pressure on these so-called deputies to prevent them from digging into this budget. And the deputies were told, of course, to keep their mouths shut, not just to keep quiet, but in general. And also not to even think about lobbying for their districts, regions, provinces, or oblasts, and not to think about getting something for themselves because there is nothing left anymore.
Military spending is the only thing left untouched in the Russian budget. Military factories are working in 3 shifts, and where Western technologies are lacking, they switch to manual assembly. At the same time, propaganda is hyping up super projects, new missiles, and experimental systems. This also does not strengthen defense capability. On the contrary, it depletes resources.
Putin supports his military-industrial complex by creating supposedly amazing ultra-destructive weapons. Adolf Hitler did the same thing. And this is a standard approach for a dictator. You don't invest in the micro-functions needed to support the army, but in grand, impressive super projects. Thank you. They say, for example, that we can completely destroy the USA with a single super missile. But this doesn't create a strong military-industrial complex. On the contrary, it just leads to unnecessary expenses.
At first, since the beginning of the war, defense spending was not increased, but kept at the same level. Military production peaked last year, and since then the pace has either remained the same or even decreased.
That was already the peak of military production. They've already passed it. Maybe with drones they're not increasing production, but with most equipment they aren't ramping up. We have a shortage of electronics, engines, optics, aerostats, and spare parts. Equipment is often repaired by disassembling and reassembling, what's called cannibalization, taking apart other tanks and making one out of three or something along those lines. That is, they are probably able to maintain the current, so to speak, offensive until 2027, but they are not able to gain a sustained advantage. And of course, all the machines, German Western ones, will break down and the Chinese ones won't be able to replace them. So
the Russian economy is under pressure not only from Western sanctions, but also from Ukrainian long-range strikes, both on the oil industry and on military production facilities.
All of this together leads to a large budget deficit, inflation, slower growth, and bleak prospects for the standard of living. This is, in total, a kind of combined effect over the past 3 years. But even despite this, I still believe that the Russian economy, though barely hanging on, barely breathing, is still alive. Cutting spending, raising taxes, and directing more funds to defense allow them to keep fighting.
In addition, the aggressor still has a backup cushion of about $600 billion in international reserves in gold and yuan. But there is another source of funds. These are the savings of Russians.
Russian citizens don't have a lot of money in Russian banks. That is, if things get really bad, if a major crisis hits the Kremlin, they could simply confiscate the savings of Russian citizens,
which are substantial, and simply use this money to keep funding the war. If the base price of oil stays between 55 and 75, if the gas embargo lasts until 2027, and if growth remains at zero, then they are capable of continuing this war until 2027. With this money they've accumulated or that they have in reserves or in gold, they'll start selling it off.
Even the Russian dictator himself has already admitted there are problems in the economy, but he has no intention of changing his priorities.
Russia will keep fighting until then. As long as we allow them to do this, if the rest of the world truly wanted it, we could stop the war within a week. If you imagine the absence of Chinese support, no export of oil, gas, or petroleum products, and no access to the global financial and legal systems, ultimately it's not just a matter of Russia's strength, but also a question of the weakness of the West and the entire world.
Neither economic decline nor a drop in people's living standards will stop Russia's desire to wage war. But the crisis processes are deepening. And even after the war ends, it will take years to restore the economy. The aggressor. Svetlana Chernetska details, Inter TV channel, Marathon, United News.
Ukraine is receiving weapons worth $1 billion. Agreements for this amount were reached during the meeting of foreign ministers. The NATO countries' meeting took place the day before in Brussels. Kyiv was represented by Chief Diplomat Andriy Sybiha. The funds will be provided under the Pearl program. NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte also confirmed the expansion of this initiative. Among the alliance member countries, 2/3 are already involved in programs to purchase American weapons for Ukraine. In addition, 2 more non-aligned states have joined the project.
The Allies commit to providing more resources to support Ukraine. These include Canada, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, and Poland. We have received confirmation from Australia and New Zealand that they will also contribute to Pearl. These are the first NATO partners to take such a step. This means that allies and partners have already committed to providing over $4 billion for the Pearl program, which will bring us to a total of $5 billion per year.